It is wonderful to see you all here. And what better day for an author event about Shakespeare than April 23rd, Shakespeare's birthday? It's almost like we planned that, right? Yeah. Oh, I'll take applause for that, absolutely. As I've often said, this author event series is one of the city's great cultural treasures. By bringing authors together with readers, we create a space for engaging conversations, for exciting conversations, and we make the literary world accessible to the Philadelphia community. There's still much more to come in our spring season. From now through early June, we'll welcome to this stage poets, novelists, physicians, political commentators, a United States senator, and more. I do hope you will join us. You can register for these events on our webpage at freelibraryfoundation.org. I also want to say just a few quick words about our organization in general. The foundation works together with the Free Library to support programming and advance its mission of promoting literacy throughout the Philadelphia region. As a nonprofit, we are, of course, reliant upon your support to achieve these goals, so please do consider donating, which you can do through our website. Again, that's freelibraryfoundation.org. Before we get to tonight's program, there are a few people and organizations I would like to thank. We are grateful first and foremost to this season's sponsor, Comcast, whose support allows us to keep these events as accessible and as affordable as possible. I would also like to thank Uncle Bobby's, our partner bookseller, and the Philadelphia Citizen, our new media partner. Tonight, we welcome Rhodri Lewis, who, after many years at Oxford, moved to Princeton, where he teaches English and comparative literature. He is the author of Hamlet and the Vision of Darkness, and Language, Mind, and Nature, Artificial Languages in England, From Bacon to Locke. For the duration of the next academic year, he will be a Guggenheim Fellow, just announced last week, and he is currently at work on a biography of the great literary critic Frank Kermode, as well as a new edition and translation of Francis Bacon's Wisdom of the Ancients. Tonight, he will be speaking with us about his groundbreaking new work of Shakespearean scholarship entitled Shakespeare's Tragic Art, which was a New Yorker Book of the Year for 2024. He will be joined in conversation by Emily Wilson, who is chair of the Department of Classical Studies and holds the College for Women Class of 1963 professorship in the humanities at the University of Pennsylvania. Her books include Mocked with Death, Tragic Overliving from Sophocles to Milton, The Death of Socrates, Hero, Villain, Chatterbox, Saint, and The Greatest Empire, A Life of Seneca. She published a translation of the Odyssey in iambic pentameter in 2017 and of the Iliad in fall 2023. She's now working on a verse translation of Ovid's Heroides and a fictionalized retelling of the ancient myths associated with the Trojan War. She was named a MacArthur Fellow in 2019 and won a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2020. Folks, I cannot imagine a better way to spend Shakespeare's 461st birthday. Please join me in welcoming Rhodri Lewis and Emily Wilson.
Hi there. I'm going to begin with a short reading from the conclusion, or the concluding chapter of the book. And so you have to imagine yourself challenged, charmed, provoked, persuaded by the preceding 350 pages before we get to this, but we'll see how we go. What binds the plays together as a family, if not a genre or subgenre of their own, is their author's preoccupation with tragic plotting. Specifically, his preoccupation with how best to devise tragic plots that operate as a principle of aesthetic order while simultaneously reflecting the disorder, the contingency and happenstance and extraordinariness that are fundamental to the human experience as Shakespeare apprehended it. Iris Murdoch offers a useful way in which to take this claim further. Deliberating on the malaise that she took to have overcome cultural and intellectual life in the decade and a half after the end of World War II, she reflects that we are not isolated free choosers, monarchs of all we survey, but benighted creatures sunk in a reality whose nature we are constantly and overwhelmingly tempted to deform by fantasy. The most prominent and persistent of these fantasies is the conviction that we have grasped the meaning of life. perhaps the pursuit of political or economic equality, perhaps the pursuit of eternal beatitude through obedience to God the Creator, perhaps the pursuit of sexual pleasure or self-determination, perhaps the pursuit of a racially or ethnically homogeneous society, perhaps the pursuit of eudaimonia, perhaps the pursuit of something else altogether. For Murdoch, although each of these pursuits may involve struggles and even anguish, all depend on the dreamlike facility with which meaning is imposed by our unavoidable subjectivity, by our need to transform things unknown into objects that we can comprehend, organize, and in some measure thereby control. If we are to understand anything of the human condition as it truly is, she goes on, what we require is a renewed sense of the difficulty and complexity of the moral life and the opacity of persons. Murdoch concludes by agreeing with Simone Weil that as morality is a matter of attention, not of will, what is needed above all else is a new vocabulary of attention. Shakespeare's tragedies are an effort to provide something very close to this vocabulary of attention. Where they differ from what Murdoch envisages is in their awareness that such vocabularies can never hope to be either new or transparent. Instead, Shakespeare depicts the human condition as, for better or worse, wedded to the linguistic, cultural, and discursive traditions within which people learn to think and speak. The kind of attentiveness that his tragedies afford us involves an acceptance both that this is the case and that we are bound to representative media in contemplating ourselves or anything else at all. The crucial distinction is not thus between the plain sense of things and a vision of reality deformed by fantasy, but between fictions of order that acknowledge themselves as such and those that insist on their truth value. Whether the things we encounter are human, animal, vegetable, mineral, or notional, whether they are simple or complex, whether they are conditions like those we call bliss, pain, and hunger, whether they are conditions we can only imagine, like death, all need to be translated into objecthood if we are to think about them. These translations depend on the language and assumptions through which our minds process the world. And because that world is not fully intelligible to human beings, these translations obscure as much as they reveal. Now, to some theological and philosophical mindsets, I imagine that to discuss Shakespeare's tragedies in these terms is to veer off into relativistic nihilism, to force these transcendent celebrations of human complexity into the barren postmodern terrain within which truth, virtue, and beauty are laughed to scorn. Shakespeare strikes me more as a temperamental skeptic than as a relativist, but put this to one side. Rather than truth of the absolutist sort promulgated by a Plato, an Augustine, a Kant, or a Hegel, Shakespeare's tragedies traffic in something of greater humility and, in my view, courage. Not hard and fast answers about the nature of things or the fundamentals of being alive, or even an illustration of the difficulties that we face in arriving at such hard and fast answers, but the space in which to recognize and reflect upon the imponderables of the human condition and of the ways in which we are equipped to respond to them. This space is a property of the irony with which Shakespeare wrote. Within it, we are prompted to move beyond the muddled habits of imitation and pretense through which we understand ourselves as objects, or rather, to move beyond some of the muddle and acknowledge that it's only through habits of imitation and pretense that we are able to think, and to think critically at all. Through such an acknowledgement, and with it an acceptance that we cannot know ourselves or our environments as they really are, comes the realization that we can understand something of ourselves as actors, as intelligent creatures who do things, who have the capacity, the freedom, to choose what they do, even as the choices open to them are often grim, and whose actions, whether the work of their hands or their mouths, have consequences for themselves and for those around them. It is the failure of such acknowledgement under the pressure of desire, fear, conceit, expectation, or ideological conviction that is the engine of all Shakespeare's tragic plots. Fini.
Thank you for that. that wonderful reading, which I think really sets us up well to understand the argument of your book. I think this is a wonderful book, which everyone should buy and read. It's really great. And I think it's great because it is both very learned and really goes in deep into Shakespeare's sources, especially his classical sources, his engagement with humanism and all the things that he learned from his schoolboy Latin and less Greek. But it also goes in, it's not just spotting of sources, it's also making this grand argument about what Shakespeare was doing with all this learning. And so I thought maybe we could start with you, as obviously a learned Shakespearean scholar, how did you get to this point of writing this book? I know that you came to it after your Hamlet book and realized that there was a much bigger story you wanted to tell that wasn't just about Hamlet, but was about Shakespeare's tragedy much more broadly than that. So could you tell us the origin story for the book?
Sure. Thank you, Emily. Thanks for those kind comments, and thanks to everyone here for coming along as well. I suppose the origin story is, as Emily just said, in 2017 I published a book called Hamlet and the Vision of Darkness, which attempted to do some of the things for Hamlet that I do for Shakespearean tragedy as a whole in the new book. And I sort of read it through various humanistic lenses and try to show that many of the times that Hamlet is being sort of at his most eloquent, he's in fact being a little bit confused, and that the audiences in 1600, say, would have noticed that, and that it wasn't there by accident, and this is part of the dramatic design and that sort of thing. And it's probably fair to say that most people who read that book quite liked it. That there was a number of others who took different views and pointed out things that seemed to them either sort of willfully wrong-headed or missing. And I, it's a sort of thin-skinned soul, began thinking about some of these questions and figured actually they may have had a point, even if they were wrong, as it were, and found myself getting more and more interested in some of the questions about the sort of the things I was just talking about in that passage, the way in which Shakespeare tries to dramatize the different languages and the different approaches we use to try to understand ourselves and the world around us. And well, to cut a long story short, I couldn't write another book about Hamlet. That would just have been absurd. And, a provocation too far for even the most patient of readers. And I was talking to various colleagues, and they said, you should just do the tragedies. And I initially resisted that because, it seems, those whom the gods would destroy, they first afflict with the urge to write path-breaking books on Shakespearean tragedy. And got away with it once. Why would I do it again? But anyway, I lent into the risk. And I'm glad I did, because in fact it helped me to see certain things about Hamlet much more clearly, as well as I don't know whether arc is the right metaphor, but the direction of travel anyway, for Shakespearean tragedy from its first beginnings, we don't really know when, but the early 1590s with Titus Andronicus, all the way through to Coriolanus. We're not exactly sure when that was either, but maybe as late as 1609, probably about 1608. So it was an interesting. And,
it was wonderful for me as a reader to follow you on that journey. I think you show, among so many other things, it just helps the reader plot just what Shakespeare was experimenting with and learning from each experiment of the previous play and forming the next one. Something you just said I thought was really interesting and maybe worth exploring in a different direction. Even when they got it wrong, they were getting something right. I loved your account of the neoclassical resistant readings of Shakespeare. People like Nahum Tate wanting to rewrite King Lear to give it a happy ending because this is such a messy and messed up world in this play. And so we've got to fix it and make it fit the neoclassical norms, and also the romantic, messianic or redemptive ways of reading Shakespearean tragedy. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what did that history of reception help you see in terms of what they got wrong, but there was also getting something right about Shakespeare?
Nahum Tate's a really good example. Dryden's another. Samuel Johnson, who's not really a neoclassicist, but does sort of go somewhere down the same way. They all get very upset about Shakespearean tragedy because they say this man is a poetic genius. He's magnificent at the arts of characterization, but, there's not much resolution at the end of these plays. There's no kind of moral order restored. So we're going to tidy it up. Nahum Tate's most famous example, I suppose. But John Dryden tidies up Antony and Cleopatra into something he relabels All for Love, because he was Shakespeare was apparently trying to write a love tragedy, but got distracted by all this history.
Yes.
So we'll put that right. So, but they put their finger on something really important, which is that Shakespeare's plays don't offer conventional consolation or resolution of the kind that we as, school children, as it were, or college kids that are occasionally taught that tragedy is supposed to do. And, you were a distinguished classicist, also that very many classical tragedies don't offer that kind of resolution.
All kinds of things, but not that, yes.
So that I think put its finger on something and enabled me to see a little bit more clearly some of the things they weren't doing. The difference is that, they think that had Shakespeare gone to college, as it were,
Right.
or had a writing master, he'd have got this right.
Right.
He could have written as well as Ben Jonson. I think Shakespeare knew the rules and was deliberately subverting them, and suggesting that tragedy, as conventionally theorized and written in his age, is actually another way in which we sort of contrive to avert our gaze from some of the bigger questions that we don't have hard and fast answers to.
Excellent, yes. So, another way, along with comedy, along with rhetoric, along with politics, I guess when I was reading this book, I thought it was extremely persuasive as a book, not just about Shakespeare's tragic art, but also about Shakespeare's art in general. And it seems to me that Shakespeare is constantly wrestling with the ways people delude themselves, the ways different systems of delusion come into conflict with each other, and you may think, oh, I'm getting closer to the truth because I've leapt from this system of delusion to some other system of delusion, but you're still in the world of theatre. And so I was wondering, what made you decide not to write about As You Like It and All the World's a Stage? The metaphor of all the world's a stage is a running trope in this book, and the ways that the stage is sort of the master metaphor, which is a master metaphor that's in comedy as well as tragedy. So, I guess I'm wondering also whether you could talk about, do you think there's such a thing as Shakespeare and tragedy? Is it separate from comedy or separate from just Shakespeare doing stuff on the stage?
Pass. I do, but only as a sort of heuristic rather than as a thing itself. I think the relationship between comedy and tragedy, as Shakespeare writes it, is really, really powerful and interesting. Because, let's say the chronology we've got is sort of correct, and we don't really know that's true. There's about 8 or 9 years between Titus Andronicus and Hamlet. In the middle of that, he writes Romeo and Juliet, which is kind of a broken comedy. Starts out as a love comedy, and then a letter goes astray in a plague lockdown. Boom, we're into this bizarre, tragic world where everyone has to die, or everyone dies anyway. Because of, actually not because of delusion in this case, because of something going astray, but that's a sort of separate line of argumentation. What he's doing is writing lots and lots of comedies which are heavily influenced by the Roman comedians Terence and Plautus, which are often delusion is the engine of many of those plots. He's getting that through Erasmus, he's getting that through comedy as it's performed on the stage, and it's written through other things. But Shakespeare is a restless soul, and always seeking to subvert and make his own, and write things in a way that will make him stand out from the college kids who simply repeat their masters, as it were. He wants to go his own way. And I think one of the things he realizes over the course of that decade is that language of delusion, that language of, not trusting your eyes. Am I seeing something? Is this my beloved? Or is it some kind of disguise, which one gets all the time? Well, not all the time, but often in Plautus. That's something he turns into, engine of real tragic tension. So that relationship between the two does tend to collapse. A distinct way of doing things. But to answer your question, do I want to write about the comedies? I actually started out before the Hamlet book thinking that I would be writing about delusion and such in the comedies, and I ended up going back to Hamlet over and over again.
I hope you do Vol 2, because I would definitely read the comedy version of this as well.
What I need to do is to think of a way of connecting a way that satisfies me of connecting the early comedies and the late comedies, because they're very different beasts.
Yes.
But in both of them, delusion threatens all kinds of awfulness, but in fact, we end up in a happy place. The contrivances are largely dramatic in the early comedies, whereas when we get to, I don't know, The Winter's Tale or something, we are supposed to think that everything is fine because she was a statue all along, and now she's come back to life, and art wins or something. We rejoice, but it's complicated. Now, I don't have a sufficiently plausible answer.
I believe that you'll
Yes.
get there, though. Yes.
Thank
Yes. So maybe we should talk a little bit more about the whole Shakespeare's uses of the classical tradition, because I think that's obviously such a huge thread in this book. And I think one of the big strengths of the book is that you're so encyclopedic in your account of that, as Shakespeare obviously was a whole sort of magpie in how he drew from multiple different sources. And one might think, okay, Shakespeare was a dramatist, so he learned comedy from the Roman comedians, and he learned tragedy from Seneca, the Roman tragedian. And I think your book really clearly shows that's not how it works. There's this whole collage of different influences. You have multiple different, I think, really persuasive accounts of Shakespeare constantly playing Ovid and Virgil off against each other. So talk a little bit about humanism and how Shakespeare uses all of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, when we tend to talk about Shakespeare, it's maybe a bit too close, Shakespeare in the classics, now we tend to think about classical reception. We look at, not so much the Greeks for Shakespeare, but we look at Virgil, we look at Ovid, we look at Seneca, we look at Plautus and Terence, like I just did, and we find there are all sorts of interesting parallels. What the big difference is, we do that, as it were, author-led, looking for resonances and echoes of different kinds within the Shakespearean texts and these things that went before. The Roman literary world was, however, the basic sort of the ground level of the educational curriculum in 16th century England. So if you're like Shakespeare, you're a grammar school boy, the teaching medium is Latin, and you are working on all these Latin authors from the age of about 9 onwards. We think Shakespeare leaves school at about 14 or 15, we're not sure. And so you are being constantly exposed to all these Latin authors, but not because they're good at tragedy, or because they're good at comedy, or even because they're sort of moral exemplars, but because they write really well, and because the humanistic curriculum of the grammar school is designed to teach you to write and think in an eloquent sort of way. And according to the sort of governing ideology of humanism, if you could do that, you would, by virtue of being someone who could speak eloquently, become a person who's virtuous. Because nobody who's not virtuous can speak eloquently. There are problems with this mode of argumentation. And just to give you one sort of inkling of the way in which Shakespeare changes that, he's one of a generation, I suppose. Christopher Marlowe does it a little bit in some of his plays, to write characters who speak utterly wonderfully, but who, are at best morally dubious and oftentimes morally dreadful. Richard III being a case in point. He's charismatic, he's funny, he's much more intelligent than anybody else on the stage, and yet he's, whether evil is the right word, I don't know, but he's not someone you'd want to really have, looking after your kids, or something of the sort. And we see the same sort of thing in the tragedies, the sort of collision between, say, Claudius and Hamlet. Both speak beautifully.
Yes, right.
One is a hypocrite, the other is confused.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about hypocrisy, because that's a theme that also comes up repeatedly in the book. And the question about, if you speak beautifully but there's something different on the inside, does that mean the thing on the inside is the real thing? And we can somehow get to the real thing. I mean, Hamlet's famous line of, I have that within that passeth show. This is about the trappings and the suits of woe. And it seems to me that your reading is suggesting that we shouldn't be looking there for, oh, look, Shakespeare just invented the human. Oh, we have now the individual who's not suddenly emerged emerging out of all of that blah, blah, blah of classical rhetoric. Here is somebody who really is an individual and a true constant person, and we could really relate to that, and we want that. And I think your book is actually unpicking a lot of that by showing us that there's just multiple, it's not turtles all the way down, but it's rhetoric all the way down.
Yeah. Shakespeare did not invent the human. Just put that out.
Yeah, I figured you
not
would
to speak ill of the dead.
that, yes.
That's just wrong.
Yes.
I think what I'd probably say that Shakespeare thought was that eloquence of all kinds, but particularly rhetorical eloquence, is instrumental.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a matter that's utterly indifferent to what you have inside.
Mm.
It's like being able to, make a paper aeroplane.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Right.
bad example because they hadn't been invented yet. But to do any kind of trick with your hand, it is simply a skill, a technique that you learn and that you master, and you either have it or you don't, and it has no relation to what's inside,
Right.
Be that positive or negative, which is actually an interesting view that goes against lots of Shakespeare's contemporaries. But the bigger question then is that within, and I think which passes show, I suppose, the problem that I think all Shakespeare's tragic protagonists certainly grapple with is, how. If I'm not going to use language, how can I even talk to myself about what I really am? And, I can turn to my local clergyman, I can turn to Cicero. If I'm learned, I can turn to Aristotle or Plato, and they'll all give me answers, but they are essentially lines I learn.
Yes.
And they are mapped onto whatever that within might be, rather than being something that emerges from it. And I think that the problem in a sense, the central problem, as I sort of half suggested in some of those remarks from the conclusion, is that, we don't. Unless we're sort of, I don't know, Ralph Waldo Emerson or something, and we find some transcendent more means of escaping language through language. We are constrained to understanding ourselves through language, and language is social.
Yes.
So all those patterns, and so I suppose I'm trying to think of the nice way of putting this. It's a bit like saying the best you can do is a sort of high quality off the peg jacket, but you can't get something tailored because in fact you're always just trying on different models, and some are better than others. And I think, I don't think Shakespeare was a teacher. I don't think he had a series of moral lessons, which is something we might want to come back to. I don't know, because that's not supposed to be what tragedy is about. But if there were such a lesson, it would be understanding that good enough is about as good as we can do, as long as we don't translate that good enough into something that we think is absolute or naturally true, because it isn't.
It isn't, yes.
It's magical thinking.
Yes, yes. So that wasn't for us, right? That little bell, I was really disturbed. The bell's ringing and the clock's just chiming in Julius Caesar. No, we're all good, right? Yes. So maybe from there, I'm wondering where to go from there, because we obviously can't get into all of the plays that you so brilliantly discuss in this book. I'm thinking maybe the obvious next place to go is King Lear on the Heath, and which is in a way an experiment in, if you strip everything down, then you're still left with all kinds of problems. Even if you've cast off the body politic, then here's the body natural, and Lear asking, who is it that can tell me who I am? Lear still needs society, even when he's rejected society. So I'm sort of wondering if you can talk more about, are there alternatives to language or alternatives to being with other people that Shakespeare's characters experiment with and find fails?
Yes. The Heath is a good example. It's not quite the invention of the soliloquy, but certainly the development of the soliloquy in a new and extraordinary direction, which is, somebody on their own talking to themselves, and coming up against exactly the problem that Lear did. Lear, for all the fact that he's stripped himself down naked, is playing a certain part. Not maybe quite as much as poor Tom with him, who is Edgar in disguise, as it were, playing a natural man, a natural man as imagined by, in his case, Lucretius, and by Samuel Harsnett, and by various others, often to the degree that he's actually quoting them, but Lear doesn't recognize that in various ways. And so they're all casting around for models of what, man in his natural state might actually look like. But in fact, it's just another form of masquerade's the wrong word, but performance art or something, which sounds too pejorative, but I think for Shakespeare that's actually what we do in some respects. And the soliloquy, the person on their own trying to tell the truth to themselves, as we all do, well, many of us do, many times, and bumping into the fact that the way you do that is telling stories to yourself about yourself, or attitudinizing, or getting really cross about some other person who's got in your way, or lamenting that your mother didn't give you enough hugs when you were younger, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And everyone has their story.
Yeah.
And so no, I mean there isn't.
Yeah.
Say Antony and Cleopatra
Yeah.
try to imagine themselves through sort of proto-operatic grand love as something that can transcend what's going on. But even they sort of recognize this is a way of, let's be kind, ameliorating the tensions involved in Mediterranean war with the western half of the Roman Empire, and not something that exists in and of itself. And when it does come to sort of exist in their death, it goes horribly wrong, because Antony manages to forget that Dido isn't terribly happy to see Aeneas in the afterlife. And so, you swine, no, I will not give you a smile and a wave. I'm going to go away. And then, so Cleopatra is rather more skilled as a stage manager, but even she starts to go wrong. The crown falls awry and has to be put right by others. And so there's this sense of, everyone trying to come up with, in a sense, a myth or something of themselves, or some aspects of themselves that can help them to transcend the sort of confusion, the uncertainty, that sort of thing. And it's one. This is not answering your question. This is going beyond it.
Yes.
But I mean, it is the case, I think, that the late 16th century and early 17th century in England and in Northern Europe more generally is not unlike our current age.
Yeah.
People, there were many different options on the table for meaning, a world that had seemed quite settled, at least to the majority of the population 100 years earlier, was now a complete mess. So you couldn't just join, your local society or your local church and everything would be laid out for you. You were kind of being asked to figure it out for yourselves, and people, couldn't find hard and fast answers. And so that sense of, well, some people anyway, couldn't find hard and fast answers. And I think Shakespeare is dramatizing that moment. And I think that's one of the reasons he still speaks to us as we're still grappling with that bundle of questions now, 400 and something years later. So,
and with the lack of closure. I mean, I'm wondering, so I thought you have a lot of really interesting readings of the endings of Shakespeare's tragedies. I think you also have some wonderful phrases in this book, which is very well written and has a lot of funny lines. I liked the idea that at the end of King Lear, the platitudinous inherit the earth, which I thought was a great line. And I also felt that it sort of resonates with what you've said just now about the wonderful but also bogus temptations of rhetoric, and how Antony and Cleopatra totally fall for it, as does Hamlet. But then characters like Fortinbras and Malcolm and Albany, they're not any good at rhetoric. They may not be any better at truth or politics either, but they're boring for us as the audience. Yeah. And so I'm sort of wondering, how does Shakespeare sort of set it up so that we're both, we understand that the boring characters like this come on at the end, but also they're no kind of solution to the problems that the rhetoric has raised?
I mean, I think because, do them both. Fortinbras is a sort of young gangster thug who just goes off to Poland and kills a bunch of people for kicks, and then comes back and takes over, and decides to commemorate Hamlet as a perfect soldier. I was like, hello.
Didn't you watch the play?
No,
you
precisely.
didn't, because you were off somewhere else.
He did not watch the play, and he has these rather simplistic senses of what's going on. And I think we noticed that. I mean, interestingly, the Fortinbras bit is often cut from production because it doesn't fit.
But maybe the not fitting is important, right? I mean, in terms of what you're saying about the mess.
Because, we see that both Hamlet and Claudius, in their very, very different ways, are much greater and more complex people than a little sort of thuggish teenager from Norway who happens to have won the Game of Thrones, as it were, just because the Danes all killed themselves and comes marching in with a convenient army. It's a little curious that he's marching by with an army when this happens, but I don't want to go off in a crazy conspiracy theory about that, but it is curious. And the same thing with Albany. I mean, we have heard him throughout. He's a butt of jokes. And, Goneril is not a very nice person, obviously, but she's much funnier and lighter on her rhetorical feet than her rather earnest Scottish husband. And it's a little tricky to play the Scots as earnest bores on the London stage in 1606, given that they have a new Scottish king. But nevertheless, that is what Shakespeare does. And I think we are supposed to notice the gap between both Lear and Albany and Edgar, who's also there at the end, and a little more rhetorically gifted, but no less platitudinous than Albany, and with even Edmund, I should say, who is obviously an abysmal human being, but brilliantly smart, and in possession of some good points about the corruption of the regime that allowed his father to carry on the way it was. And fast forward to Hour 2 at the end, he said, no, Gloucester was basically a saint. He was wronged by his terrible bastard son. We're all at a great loss. Now, let's tidy that all away. We won't try and think about what any of that means, and we'll just offer some half-remembered quotation from Erasmus about age and suffering, and we'll just tidy it all up and move on and have a committee, which will help us figure it all out.
Yes.
And so, we notice that gap. These are smaller, less interesting, less integral people who, might have a part in a history play, but feel flat, one-dimensional in a tragic poem. Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about what your book has to say about history in terms of the historical narrative of Shakespeare's life? Because you do engage with what's going on at the particular time that that play is being composed. But it seems to me that primarily your narrative is about Shakespeare's dramatic and aesthetic and poetic development and how he learns from one of his own previous plays to the next. But there's also a sort of underlying narrative about actually things were changing around Shakespeare as in the transition from the 1590s to the later plays.
I'll try and give a shorter answer to this one. I think I can.
Okay, it's a hard one to answer, but
most of the writing about Shakespeare, much of it very, very good, in the last 30 or 40 years, has been what in the trade we call historicist, which is to say using Shakespeare as a way of talking about the dynamics of political power or social power, sometimes sexual or gendered power, sometimes racial and colonial power. And we see Shakespeare, well, depending on, as it were, how you imagine Shakespeare, he's either on the side of the good guys or the bad guys, as it were. And there's lots of interesting things in that, because it's something that had been missing, really, from Shakespeare criticism for a couple of hundred years, really. I myself think it is a little bit limiting, because I think Shakespeare is finding in the incredibly convoluted and risky, then as now, I suppose, politics of his time, a series of starting points. But rather than, as it were, trying to take sides in, the Essex revolt or something. In 1599, the Earl of Essex tried to make himself king because Elizabeth was dying and he was a Protestant, and, he thought that everyone would rise up to him, but actually everyone thought he was a bit of a drunken blowhard, and he failed and got killed, and Shakespeare nearly got caught up in that, interestingly enough. But that's a starting point for a meditation on the nature of political power. I mean, this is the time that he's writing Henry V, Julius Caesar,
Yep.
Hamlet, and then a little bit afterwards, Troilus and Cressida. And so it's, I know I'm going to write about legitimacy and what that looks like, different political models. So I'm going to find a starting point, but actually what I'm trying to do is to then fold that into my bigger set of concerns. I don't know whether he thought like this, but maybe he just intuited it. My bigger set of concerns about how it is that we measure, what is true and valuable in the world we inhabit. Politics being the art of doing so, in society, in some way or other. So yeah, I don't think he's terribly caught up in the nitty-gritty of day-to-day politics. I think he's far too smart for that, actually, because, you may end up winning for a little while, but that narrative, so to speak, will soon shift, and you can find yourself in big trouble. And lots of Shakespeare's famous fellow dramatists did.
Yep.
So I think he steers clear and tries to use contemporary history, his contemporary history, as a sort of springboard to other concerns.
Yeah. I mean, I think we may already, in a way, have talked about this, but I'd be curious to learn more about Shakespeare's vision of, or uses of tragedy as this sort of there were multiple subgenres within tragedy. And I really like the way you laid out in the Titus, Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar chapter, how these are sort of, each of them are experiments in a different style of tragedy. There's the ambition tragedy, the revenge tragedy, the domestic intrigue tragedy. And then, I mean, you don't explicitly pick up that thread in the later chapters, but it seems really clear from your account that Shakespeare never sort of later confines himself to, I'm just going to do revenge here, I'm just going to do domestic intrigue. Instead, it's always a mix of all of those things, plus a whole bunch of other stuff when he's trying out new things. So I wondered if you just talk a little bit about how does, I think especially domestic intrigue seems like it's a really important thread in so many of Shakespeare's tragedies, but then also other writing as well. I mean,
one of the things that is absolutely distinctive about tragedy as written in England in the 1590s through to the late 16 teens is this subgenre we call domestic tragedy. Tragedy, as it's normally written in the ancient world, as in the early modern one, is about great people, kings, queens, generals, princes, and there's all kinds of reasons for that, but principally because, when a king or a prince or someone gets it wrong, there are huge implications that are very obvious for everyone who counts themselves their subjects. One of the things that is changing in England in the 1580s and 1590s is that London is beginning to get the first beginnings, I should really say, of a kind of, middle class, commercial middle class. London is growing. Many people are leaving their homes in the countryside, and so the city is growing, and this whole, a new sort of bürgerlich, as it were, class is developing. And Shakespeare is not probably, although he may have had a hand in the first of these plays called Arden of Faversham, but probably not in my view, he gets in on this idea that domestic tragedy, we can write tragedies that are about ordinary people like you and me, not just about kings and queens in various different ways. And that brings all different kinds of energies, social energies, people from lower down the social order. And so Shakespeare, I think, from the 1590s, I call those the three tragedies he writes in the early 1590s, Titus Andronicus, Romeo and Juliet, and Julius Caesar, they're kind of apprentice pieces. They're much more than that. But let's just...
kind of a good place to, yes.
Yeah. But he's learning,
Yeah.
all interspersed with lots of comedies and lots of histories where he's, also taking in new information and learning new techniques. And then, I don't know, how do you explain something like Hamlet? But he starts writing something that, we think of as recognizably Shakespearean tragedy. And as you say, it does all of those things.
Yeah.
And it's self-consciously doing and deliberately doing all of those things.
Right.
Even something like Hamlet, which is, you'd think a standard issue play at court, has a whole range of other people in the court itself, Horatio, Rosencrantz, and Guildenstern, and then we have the gravedigger, the two gravediggers scene. And, that's not just Shakespeare, doing the police in different voices because he can. He's trying to suggest something, universalizing is not the right term, but a commonality about tragedy. Tragedy is not something that just happens to the high ups
Yes.
when they discover that the woman they've loved all their life is actually mum.
Right. Yes.
Or something.
Yeah.
It is something that can affect, and the passions that lead to tragedy are something that can affect ordinary people.
Yes. I mean, I think Oedipus thinks he's an ordinary person, and that's
No,
part of the issue. I mean, I think there's a whole other conversation we could have about Oedipus as actually not quite as distant from all of this kind of stuff
That's a very good point.
as you might think. But I also just got the sign that we have to wrap it up, and we have to invite questions from the audience. So thank you so much for talking. It was I learned so much from this book and from you. Thank you. So there's going to be a couple of roving mics. Please don't ask your question until the mic comes to you, but please do ask your question, because we have, I think, 10, 15 minutes for audience Q&A, and we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much for your talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. If you can speak to this more, and again, I hope you will pick up your next book to talk more about the comedies. I've actually, the timing is a little eerie. I've actually just been teaching A Winter's Tale, and I'm wondering if you can speak any more to, and again, the idea of self-delusion and how you're giving me a lot of things to sort of wrestle with right now as far as like how to read them into that play as well. If you could speak to that a little further, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure, yeah. I mean, The Winter's Tale, I mean, one of Shakespeare's favorite tricks, right, in his tragedies, does this in Romeo and Juliet, does it again in Othello. It starts out as a comedy. I mean, in a sense, we don't think that anymore because we know these plays. But imagine you were seeing it for the first time. And then he breaks it through a series of contingencies, through a series of illusions, all that sort of thing. And I think he enjoys the intellectual challenge of flipping that around, particularly in The Winter's Tale, which is to say, I'm going to write a tragedy and then break it and turn it into something comedic. I don't know how clearly by the time he's finished, we're not exactly sure of the order in which Timon of Athens and Coriolanus are written, but they're about the same time. And I speculate that Timon of Athens comes first and Coriolanus comes second. And tragedy as a mode has kind of lost a bit of its fire for him, lost a bit of its ability to challenge him as an artist. He knows how to bring these things around, and actually the sort of the kind of catharsis I think he's interested in, the sort of clarification of the way things are. The kind of clarification he's offering threatens to swamp the art. At the end of Coriolanus, it's pretty hard. Even as a sort of committed feel-good theologian, as it were, to find a cheerful lesson or moral for life, because I just think it's such a dark play about ambition and blindness and political conniving, and so he wants to do something else because he has to keep writing, because he has to keep making money, because that's his job, and so he comes to these late plays. And yes, tragicomedy is something the Italians have invented 50 or so years before, and he's very familiar with those models and is learning from them. But I don't have an answer for how it is that he suddenly thinks tragedy can be turned back into comedy because I say so. But that's what he does. And it's not, it does not, when it's done well, it does not feel forced. You don't come away thinking, hang on a minute, he's lost his nerve here. There is, real pathos and affect when you see that, Hermione is coming back to life, and all of a sudden the man who thinks he's destroyed everything actually has it all there. A little bit older, a little bit wiser, and it's touching. But work in progress.
I think maybe you touched on this, but how would you separate the histories from the tragedies in terms of the general theme?
What do you mean by theme?
Well, however you want to take it. I mean, how would you, you spoke about tragedies.
Yeah.
Would you put the histories in that class, would you see them differently than the tragedies? How do you view the history plays?
Well, I mean, one joke would be as often as possible because I think they're great. I mean, as a history playwright, Shakespeare was more bound by the record. We know how this ends. We know how it has to end, and we know that it's a narrative that informs the sort of history of the nation in various different ways. So yes, in terms of characterization, he can do many of the same things, talking about delusionality, going into sort of high-flown philosophical language, but when it comes to, take a good example, like, well, I could do Richard II or Richard III. They're both extremely charismatic people, characters, who would not be out of place in a tragedy, but whose end and whose affect cannot be allowed to become tragic because the historical narrative with which Shakespeare is working, from Holinshead and from others, has given him a certain shape there. Richard may be cool, but actually we have to show that he's a villain. Richard III may be cool, but we have to show that he's a villain, and we have to undermine that. So you don't get, the standard essay that students often write is comparing Richard III and Macbeth. Very similar characters, bad guys who make themselves into kings through, campaigns of very nicely calculated terror. We have some species of tragic identification, I think, with Macbeth, even as, he unravels into sort of monstrosity and confusion and that sort of thing. Richard doesn't. I mean, we get the cool Richard at the beginning, and then Shakespeare isn't. No. He has to be somebody who is pushed to one side historically, because we know that Henry Tudor, or Richmond as he is in the play, has to be the guy who wins. And that can feel a bit artificial and a bit forced. But, in a sense, because it's not a tragedy, that slight artificiality is just nodding to the requirements of history, rather than something that works to, pull the plug on tragic closure or anything of that sort.
On the subject of comedy into tragedy, what about a character like Falstaff? Because, there's a comic character, but his end is tragic.
Sad.
Sad, but not tragic.
I wouldn't say. I mean, he gets to die like Socrates, which is,
In prose.
In prose, yeah. He gets the death of a great teacher who's been punished for saying too many things. So yes, it is sad, but such is politics. I mean, Henry has been a model humanist king. He's hung out with the rogues and the ruffians, so he knows how to govern them. And his friend, the rogue and the ruffian, who's very charming and very funny, but also, very often on thin ice, to say the least, morally, particularly on the battlefield of Shrewsbury, doesn't fit. Yeah. And so gets banished, and then dies quietly coldly from the feet up, in a way that I think, it was not my claim particularly, I think most people agree is giving him the death of Socrates, to suggest that actually, this is, it's sad, but it's not tragic. I mean, in a sense,
Okay.
Falstaff could have been killed for a zillion other things before. He's a miscreant, charming one, but...
Yes, Professor Lewis, first of all, I want to thank you for leaving your very successful rugby football career to become a Shakespearean scholar. But I'm very interested in I believe you're working on a biography of Frank Kermode, the great Manxman scholar of Shakespeare and other aspects of English literature. And in his autobiography, not entitled, among many witticisms, he says he served in His Majesty's Royal Navy during World War II, and he says the problem with doing national military service is that it leaves you totally unable to do any other kind of a job for the rest of your life. But my question to you is, what makes you want to write a biography of Frank Kermode? I find him very interesting, but I've read his criticism over many years, and again, not entitled. What made you pick him?
Well, he sort of picked me, as it were. It was the deep and dark first summer of the lockdown, and I was stuck in Princeton, which is pretty in its way, but gets a little samey, shall we say, after a while. And I wasn't allowed. No one was allowed into the library. And I bumped into one of the Rare Books librarians who lives 2 streets over from me. And I was saying, what can I do? And he said, well, you should come in and look at Frank Kermode's papers. Oh, they're in Princeton, are they? So I went to have a look at these, sort of in a spirit of pious curiosity, and found a couple of things that interested me, and sort of kept on reading. Anyway, I think it's a extraordinarily interesting life. Suffice it to say that not entitled, though a work of extreme rhetorical skill, does not tell very much of the story. What's very useful is that in his archive, though, there is an earlier autobiography from 1975, which tells much more of the story, particularly about what he got up to in World War II. But anyway, leave that aside. So, fascinating life from complete poverty and obscurity in a tenement in Douglas and the Isle of Man to, famous Sir Frank in New York and in London and everywhere else. But also a really fascinating window on the changing status of literary study within and beyond the academy, from its huge expansion in the 50s and 60s to the sort of confusing apotheosis in the 70s and 80s, and the sort of slow recessional in the time since then. And Kermode is there in the middle, both in the universities and in the literary journals and in the media. And it's really interesting lens. And no one's really written that book yet, so it's a sort of half about Frank and well, maybe 2/3 about Frank, and a third of sort of what it was to study literature and think about literature, and how could you suddenly get really famous and rich in the 1970s and 80s by being a literary critic, and how can we bring it back?
That would be great. So I got the signal that we are almost out of time. If there's one quick Shakespeare question, we could wrap up with a last quick Shakespeare question.
Coriolanus, a lesson you might get from it at the end is the power of the mother's love and the connection to the mother and offspring. Falstaff, I will never forgive Shakespeare for the Merry Wives of Windsor and what he did to Falstaff in that play. My question is, what do you think is Shakespeare's wackiest play?
Wackiest
play. I have an answer, but I want to hear yours.
What does wacky mean first, very quickly?
Original, absurd, throwing in everything he can possibly throw in, almost incoherent. Of course, there's a coherence in the incoherency.
Taurus and Cressida.
Really?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Good answer.
Okay. I see much more of a coherence to that, but by the way, in the scene in that play, do you think that her kissing all the Greek officers was euphemistic?
Ooh. Pass again. Don't know. It hadn't occurred to me, but I'm not going to say it wasn't.
Okay.
Because it's
my nomination for wackiest play is Cymbeline.
Oh God, Cymbeline is mental. You're absolutely right. Yeah, no, it is. It is.
Okay. So thank you. On that mental note, we should thank you one more time. Please don't forget to buy the book in the lobby. Rhodri will be signing copies. Right? I think he will. Yes.
Yes, he absolutely
Yes,
will.
good.
There are copies upstairs for sale in the lobby. Rhodri has kindly agreed to sign them. But before we adjourn, can we have one more round of applause for a great conversation?